Oh, just a gentle reminder, I think, for the audience that you can submit your question to slido.com with the code of AIFED 2018. And for the speaker, just a gentle reminder, you do have your time there to remind you about the length of the speech that you have left. So please, Jesus, start.
Thank you so much. Very good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Asian Development Bank, we're delighted to be here, participate, organize the forum. It's a great pleasure to participate in a forum on economic transformation, extremely pertinent for the development in Indonesia. Look, the title of my presentation is the title of a report that will be launched in the next few weeks. It's a report that we have been developing with the government of Indonesia, in particular with Bappenas, the planning agency, under the guidance of Minister Brojonegoro and his staff. And as I said, it's going to be launched in January, February of 2019. I will tell you more at the end of my presentation. Look, what I'm going to do essentially is a follow-up on Pak Suwa's presentation. He really laid the ground for what I'm going to say, because much of the work that this report contains is about why manufacturing matters and why it is absolutely fundamental for the development of Indonesia. All right. I'm going in the wrong direction completely. All right. Here, that's where I want to go. That's where I wanted to go. Now I understand how it works. All right. We have been working with Bappenas during all this year, preparing this report that we hope is going to be influential in the upcoming medium-term plan 2020-24. The focus has been clearly on the role of the manufacturing sector. I was really delighted to see before, when Pak Suwa was polling the audience, that 70% really thought that manufacturing does matter, because this is the essence of this report. Our initial discussions with the minister when back in time were about what has happened to Indonesia in the long run. If you look at, this was a country that was part of the East Asian Miracle Report, as the minister was mentioning this morning. But something happened in 97, 98. This was the country probably the hardest hit in the region. And since then, growth has really declined significantly. Our estimates indicate that potential growth in Indonesia in 95, 96, before the financial crisis hit, was about 9.5%. Today, it is about 5.5%, which more or less coincides with actual growth. So there has been a significant decline on the potential of this economy to grow really fast, of 4 percentage points. The role of manufacturing as engine of growth significantly declined afterwards. The speed and the direction of a structural transformation, as Pak Suwa was also indicating before, really a complete change. And the economy today is on a much lower potential growth. Why do these issues matter? Because Indonesia is the fourth most populous nation in the world. It needs to create not just employment, but good employment, and because the government has legitimate aspirations to provide Indonesians with a high living standard. So with this in mind, we had a lot of conversations with the minister and his staff. In the whole report, what we have been doing during this year is trying to answer 3 fundamental questions that appear here. So these 3 fundamental questions are the following. The first one that the minister threw on the table was, can we achieve a growth rate of 7 to 8% during the next 5 years? And today, we're about to launch the report, and the conclusion is very clear. No, with the current economic structure. Indonesia cannot grow at 7 to 8%. We're talking sustained growth. I do not know what will happen 1 year. Sustained growth rate 7 to 8%, no, with the current economic structure. Why is that? Well, much has to do with the lack of a robust manufacturing sector. Now we define in a second what I mean by this. So the question is, can we have a second chance? Can the manufacturing sector have a second chance? And what we argue is that maybe, there is some sort of light at the end of the tunnel. And the maybe is we need some sort of a plan here so that the public and private sectors do cooperate. I'm going to talk in my presentation about the role of the private sector, which is something that nobody has mentioned so far in the forum until today. Okay? And the third question was, what is the role of government? And what we argue in this report is that the government needs to be, would be fundamental, but in the context of what we call modern industrial policy, okay? So what I'm gonna do in the next few minutes is talk, obviously, about the last two questions. I'm gonna focus a little bit. It is absolutely impossible to be comprehensive to talk about the many things that the report covered. So I'm gonna focus basically on three questions. And the three questions are the following. The first one is, what have been the main obstacles to Indonesia's industrialization? The second one is, what manufacturing products Indonesia should focus on? And I underline the word should, because it really is opening a can of worms, formulated that way. And the third one is, what type of industrial policy does Indonesia need today, if any? Because some people might say, of course, forget about it. There is no need for any industrial policy. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these three questions. Now, let me make it very clear why they matter. These are issues that have been pointed out in different ways until now, but I want to do it my way. The first one is, let me show you these slides. These are the export shares in percentage of the most complex products. Complex products are what you have in mind. These are the airplanes, the MRI machines, et cetera, et cetera. These are the products that every country wants to produce and export. You have the export shares of several economies there. These are the top most complex products. This is in a database that we have 5,000 products. Then you have the top 500 and the top 1,000. Indonesia exports not a single product in the top 100, most complex. This is why all this conversation does matter. You do not export a single product. You export a little bit, you need to go back to the top 500, and we need to go to the top 1,000. But compare those numbers with those of the other countries that you have there. Even India, I would say. Okay? So this is one reason why this discussion matters. The second reason, this has been pointed out in different ways in today's discussion, is the type of structural transformation that Indonesia is undergoing. What you have on the horizontal axis here is the change in the shares, sectoral shares, and the vertical axis, what you have is productivity growth. So what you see is that the agricultural sector is, of course, the one that has been losing employment in terms of share. So the share has declined between 1995 and 2017 by about 15 percentage points. Where has that employment gone? You look to the right. And the answer is, of course, services, with the big qualifier. Not just any services, non-tradable services. And this does matter tremendously when we talk about the structural transformation and wages and income per capita, because non-tradable services will never give you $100,000 wages, which is when people start talking about services, people confuse. The biggest employer today in Indonesia, other than agriculture, is wholesale, retail trade, restaurants, and hotels. And those jobs do not pay $100,000. Not only that, if you look at the vertical axis, the productivity growth rates of all these sectors in Indonesia during this 20-year period has been about 0. That's what the vertical axis tells you. Peanuts. So this is why this discussion does matter. Number 3, and emphasizing the point that I just made about non-tradable sectors, we have made, my staff and I have made estimates of the tradable employment across 60 countries in the world. And what we document in the case of Indonesia and many other developing countries in Asia and the rest of the world is that the share of employment in tradables has been declined. What is employment in tradables? Agriculture, manufacturing, and the like. What are the non-tradables that have gained employment? Wholesale and retail trade, hotels and restaurants, and construction. So tradable employment in Indonesia since the mid-70s until today has declined by about 20 percentage points. This is the drama and the dilemma of developing countries today, but also of advanced economies. What do you think is the complaints of advanced economies? That jobs are in the service sector with this big qualifier. It's not any service, it's non-tradable services. And those jobs, in most cases, are subject to very little productivity gains, which means very low wage increases. That is the dilemma of the 21st century. All right? So this is Indonesia. So let me, with this background, and why, from my point of view, what we're doing here today and tomorrow does matter. I go to the 3 questions that I was talking about. I'm going to try to be very clinical. What have been the main obstacles to Indonesia's industrialization? 2 types of reasons. The first 3 I put here are historical reasons. The first one is the nature of this economy. You have oil, and with oil, the incentive to industrialize really disappears. And this has happened to many other economies in the world. And oil has always been here, and the economy goes up and down. When the price of oil reaches $150, who wants to industrialize? Not a problem. Let's just continue with oil. The second one is that Indonesia had an extensive industrial policy system in the 70s and 80s, but it was very poorly designed, especially if you compare it to countries like those of countries like Singapore or Korea. Very, very poorly designed. And number 3 is that Indonesia failed and still today lacks a large indigenous manufacturing sector. The biggest industrialization process of Indonesia took place where? In the 1980s and early 1990s. But it was Japanese-driven. It was Japanese FDI. When that collapsed, your industrialization process died. And since then, there has been very little industrialization in Indonesia. Industrialization in the direction of diversification of the economy, upgrading, sophistication, what I mean by creating complex products, and increasing the manufacturing employment share, which in Indonesia is about 14–15%. When all the advanced economies were industrializing, they managed to put over 30% of total employment in manufacturing. No single developing country is doing this today, not even China, where the manufacturing share of employment manufacturing share is barely 20%, it's less than 20%. No single country is doing that today, okay? The other type of reason why Indonesia fails to industrialize is a myriad of reasons. First of all, I don't know if you know, 99% of the companies in the manufacturing sector are micro and small. It's extremely difficult to talk about upgrading when 99% of your companies have at most 10 workers, when most of them have 4 workers, micro companies. There is very little R&D, low quality of vocational training, we have talked about it, poor connection university, private sector, global value chains. Basically, Indonesia is a supplier of raw materials to other companies. And there are some sector-specific constraints. The question of electricity, land registration, labor market issues that do not affect every single sector. So these are very, very sector-specific. So for all these reasons, Indonesia is still today at $4,000 per capita income with a growth rate of 5% when it would like to grow at 7 to 8% with a relatively unsophisticated manufacturing sector. Second question, and this is the one that really, we're opening here Pandora's box. What manufacturing sector should Indonesia focus on? It's a tricky, extremely tricky question that obviously has divided economies for decades because there is a normative question here. Immediately you're talking about what is the role of the government, and focus on, for all practical purposes, means picking winners. And that I don't know whether we want to talk about it or not. What is the reality? The reality that Indonesia does have today, like most countries in the world, some system of a wide range system of incentives to the manufacturing sector. It exists, like in most countries. Now the question is, does this system work? What do these incentives do? Is it worth keeping them? What would happen to the companies that receive subsidies if tomorrow these subsidies disappear? Would they die or maybe not? Has this question or these questions been asked? Okay. So what we think is that there is a minimally sensible way of addressing these issues and talking about products and incentives in a way that could be constructive, okay? What is very, very obvious, I do think, is that, and I hope nobody asks this question, is can Indonesia undergo a massive industrialization process today, like that of South Korea? Let's avoid that question. The answer is obviously no. That will not happen in Indonesia. But what Indonesia can have is focus on some niche products of high productivity, advanced products. And that is what we're trying to do. So what we have identified is a series of products, for example, what Indonesia is already doing very well. We have identified 59 products out of the 5,000 that we have in our database. But Indonesia has significant comparative advantage, and these are above average complexity. Of course, I'm not naming here the products, but I'm giving you the sectors where they belong. So you will see that many of them are chemicals and computing. So really, really advanced products. What do you do with these products? Well, you continue upgrading with them. What will be the role of the government in these products, with these companies? Very little. These are companies that are doing very well. Why meddle? Why do you want to talk and provide subsidies when they're not needed? These are companies that probably are very, very profitable. Okay? But we have also identified 74 products with above average complexity where we think that Indonesia could do very well, could diversify. These are products where Indonesia does not have revealed comparative advantage, but is close to it. And here the story is, well, there is significant room here for diversifying and upgrading. And in this case, there might be some role for the government to help these companies in a way that I'm going to describe in a matter of minutes, okay? So these are the sectors in which these products are. We have also been doing analysis of global value chains, and this is very interesting. You remember this morning Professor Lawrence's presentation. One of the initial slides, when he was slicing the airplane, I think it was a Boeing, not Professor Lawrence, into around 10 pieces. That's very interesting. What I focused on was not on the number of pieces, but on the countries that participate in Boeing. None of them a developing country. The UK, Canada, Sweden, France, the US itself. So what happens is that there are global value chains and global value chains. And Indonesia is not in the first ones. What is Indonesia and what type of global value chains? Well, Indonesia is a provider of natural resources to other companies' value chains, but not in airplanes, natural resources. So what we have done here is some sort of analysis also. What we propose, there are some value chains where Indonesia could do well. And we're in discussions with BAPENAS and other agencies about how to move with this. But these are definitely not the top global value chains, where it's basically a monopoly of half a dozen companies in advanced economies. All right? Let me get into the final question is, what type of industrial policy does Indonesia need today? My view, and I think there are many of you who would share with me, given what I have heard this morning, is the question is not whether the government should intervene or not. To me, it's very obvious. The answer is yes. The question here is how, what type of interventions should the government of Indonesia get into? And we introduced the term modern industrial policy. And here we acknowledge that governments, at the end of the day, do intervene in every single country. And governments intervene by picking winners in different ways, because there is tremendous awareness that not all products have the same consequences for development. That's very obvious. You get stuck in bananas, and it's very difficult to move up. Everybody wants to get into what? Into the type of global value chains that Professor Lawrence was describing this morning. What happened is that it's very difficult to reach that if you start from bananas. Extremely difficult or extremely lengthy. It is in that context that there might be some room for government intervention, okay? So what will be the main objective of what we call modern industrial policy in the context of the manufacturing sector is to address market failures, in particular coordination and information failures. To do what? To upgrade and diversify the production and export structure of Indonesia. It is in that context that I'm very open and willing to talk about industrial policy, all right? Picking winners, well, it's something that you don't want to do, but I insist it's unavoidable to think that not all products have the same consequences for development. We all know the products that are associated with $40,000 wages. We all know them, and these are the products that Indonesia wants to get into. So the intention that we have here when we talk about product selection is not to pick winners in the old traditional sense, that is, often for political reasons and to subsidize them. We're far from that. We understand that. We don't propose that. What we propose is to provide information to both the government and the private sector, following very sound methodologies, and to tell them, look, you're already into this type of products, and these are complex products. Maybe you should not really get into these areas. Your companies producing and exporting these products are doing very well. But there might be other products where there might be some room for collaboration between public and private sector. In order, how do we do this? By providing certain types of inputs that the private sector needs, okay? So the key question when deciding whether to subsidize or not is obviously, is there a market failure that constrains the private sector? That's the first question that you should ask. So I put here this little diagram that synthesizes our view on this, which is, if there is no market failure, essentially, get out of the way. If there is a market failure, you still need to ask very important questions. The first one is, you identify what type of failure. What are we talking about here? What is the issue? What is the problem? The second one, absolutely fundamental, you need to talk to the private sector. You need to understand what your companies are doing. Without bringing them on the fore, it's impossible to really understand whether a subsidy is going to work or not. What type of public good do you want to provide? Is it a subsidy? Maybe yes, but maybe not. Maybe it's something else. And very, very important, I'm going to talk about in my next slides, is in exchange for what? You don't do this for free, okay? So these are the type of interventions that we think, this is a standard classification that appears in every textbook that the government could think of to promote manufacturing. What I have in the horizontal axis is two types of goods. One is public goods and the other one is market interventions. And on the vertical axis is the typical horizontal interventions versus vertical interventions. What I have in the lower corner down there is, of course, the ones that are the tricky ones, the vertical market interventions. You select a particular area. This is what nobody wants to do. We are open to that, provided this is done very sensibly and very reasonably, okay? So what I argue here is that no matter what type of assistance you want to provide to the private sector, this will have to follow the principles of modern industrial policy. What are some of these principles? Well, you provide public inputs when there is a market failure. If you identify, you say there is no market failure, you get out, okay? And what you need is people who know how to differentiate, how to answer this question. Obviously, you don't target the whole sector. That's a crime. You don't target the whole sector. You need to identify activities, particular products, okay? You need to provide this to new ones with the spillover potentials. You don't start subsidizing something that has been already for years, for decades, etc. In exchange for what? Export growth, upgrading along the lines of what we are talking about, but you don't do it for free, okay? Under some principles, a sunset clause, we're going to help you for whatever number of years is reasonable here. Then we strike a deal, okay? You combine what I call long jumps with short steps. I'm going to talk about it in a second, okay? Short steps are basically products that is very easy for Indonesia to move into. Long jumps, this is the hard industrial policy. Do we go for an aircraft or not? Do we try to get into the global value chains that Professor Lawrence was talking about or not? That's a long jump, okay? And fundamental, and I want to insist, unless you bring the private sector to a discussion of industrialization in Indonesia, unless you understand what your companies are doing or are not doing, this is going to be an esoteric discussion, okay? And absolutely fundamental. All this needs to be done, even in case we talk about industrial policy in a context of competition. Absolutely fundamental, all right? So I'm going to start, I think I'm going to be doing okay in terms of time. I'm going to give you back to another very important slide related to the one at the beginning. Look, what I show you here is the world's 10 most complex products. Remember, I have a database with 5,000 products. So what we have on the left-hand side is the most complex products. This is very detailed, okay? What you have on the right-hand side is Indonesia's top 10. And what you have in parentheses is the ranking within the 5,000 and Indonesia's export share. So what this tells you is that the most complex product that I knew that this slide was going to attract attention, all of you. I see you from here. The most complex product that Indonesia exports is ranked 200. The 10th is ranked 581st. I wonder whether there is a case for discussion here. At a very high political level, could Indonesia export in the top 100 in the next 10 years? What do we need to do as a nation? That is what this slide tells you. How is it possible that a nation with 260 million people does not export a single product in the top 100? That is the story that we are discussing in this forum today, all right? So let me finish. Why does all this matter? Because at the end of the day, we're talking about how Indonesia could or could not, or will not make it into upper middle income and high income. Our thesis is that Indonesia never developed a diversified and sophisticated manufacturing sector, okay? Without it, it's going to be extremely difficult extremely difficult to make it. I address very quickly the issue of services. Yes, some services can do it, but these are logistics, finance, and don't forget, the development of these services depends on the development of manufacturing. The countries that got into advanced finance and advanced logistics, they did it because they have a manufacturing sector. This doesn't come out of the blue. And Indonesia today is not into this type of services, as I documented at the beginning of my presentation. You're into the low-end services, retail trade, etc. Okay? So my suggestion, and I finish here, is to focus sensibly on the manufacturing sector. You do some short jumps, products that it will be very easy for Indonesia to gain comparative advantage into, and consider at the very, very high political level a few long jumps. The question that I was posing a second ago, does it make sense for Indonesia to consider getting into the top 100? Maybe the answer is no, but I think it's worth considering at the highest political level. In that context is, what does Indonesia need to do? And definitely think twice about providing subsidies and incentives. You do it only after you ask yourself 3 questions: to whom, for how long, and in exchange for what? So I'm going to stop here. This is what we think is going to be the cover of the report. We're really proud of the report that we have produced during this year. We are very grateful to the government of Indonesia, in particular to Bappenas and to Minister Brojonegoro. The launch will be on February 6 in 2019 in Bappenas, and maybe we can meet again there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Jesus. Before I go to the set of questions that we received from Slido.com, the committee asked me to invite, we have 2 discussants to comment on the 2 presenters here. So let me invite Haryo Aswicahyono from CSIS to provide his comment. Mas Haryo, you here?
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I think it is very excellent presentation. I only comment to Jesus, yeah. It's a very excellent presentation, and I maybe agree on 95% of the presentation. But there are several issues that I would like to raise. First is that, again, you already anticipate maybe the concept of the complexity, yeah, the importance of complexity. I agree as a lofty goals, but I wonder about the process, etc., the detail of that. First, I would like to draw your attention to the table comparison, yeah, between Indonesia, Korea, Taiwan, etc. Yeah, and I think comparison is a tricky business, right? I wonder, what is the complexity of those countries, for example, when their income per capita is like Indonesia? Yeah. So in the original paper of complexity, we have all countries, yeah, the complexity. And I would like to, for example, know the trend as how far Indonesia far below or how far it's from the norm under our current per capita income. Maybe it's too far or not so far. Secondly, it's Indonesia is resource-rich country. So compared to other resource-rich country, is Indonesia also far left behind? And the third is always causality. Whether the development in banking, in financial services, in everything, in logistics affect the complexity, or the complexity itself that create development. So I would like to know the causality and the process, how Korea reached that level of complexity, how many years, what's the policy, etc. Yeah. And with that, I think I tend to go to the more pressing problem of Indonesia. Yeah. And hopefully, when we remove all the problems, we will naturally evolve into a complex products. So with that, I think the priority for Indonesia and the focus should be, based on my interview with firms, is removal of unnecessary regulatory burden, especially in trade, investment, and food policy. Yeah. It's so many regulatory burden facing by the firms. So I interviewed several firms. He said that in the company, we are competitive, and we are willing to diversify based on economies of scope and scale, of course, yeah, constrained by it. But once the goods and services go out of the company, then it becomes uncompetitive internationally because of logistic costs, etc., because of many things. So that's the first, and it resulted in availability of reasonable price of intermediate good. It always come out. Maybe because of trade policy that it's not good. And the second issues that always come out is labor market reform. Maybe with the new regulation on the formula of which it's already softened the concept. But we still have several other issues, such as severance payment cost. It's very high, the highest in the region. And I agree with Pak Sua, continuing building infrastructures and reducing logistic costs. Yeah. That's the main priority, I think. And policy to support Indonesia participation in global value chain and global production network, including three most important factors that affect Indonesia participation in global value chain. That is FDI regime, because all the global value chain is driven by foreign direct investment. Second is flexible labor market, because the main reason of relocation is until maybe in the near future or still, labor cost is still very important. Even though we have automatization, etc., we still have that room, as the previous speakers in the first session mentioned. And efficient services, especially logistic and manufacturing related services. You know, Indonesia is the highest in terms of protection of the services sector. It's the most protected sector in Indonesia. I mean the high end of the services, not the low end. Yeah? The many professional services. And finally, still opening up of services, of course. Yeah. I think I talked too long.
Thank you very much, Mas Haryo. Thank you for bringing those important enabling environment issues, labor market flexibility, and other important, I guess, topic that we can elaborate further. So, but first, let me invite again Pak Julian Smith from PricewaterhouseCoopers. You have 2-3 minutes, Pak.
Thank you very much, Bu. Perhaps forgive me if I just ask the audience a question. But first of all, I'd like to say it's been a tremendous privilege to be here. There's so many amazing things I've learned this morning. But one question I'd like to ask is, how many people in the room have to make a profit every year in order to keep their job the following year? So I think the voice that has been missing from the debate is the voice of business. It's certainly, Jesus made a few points on this theme, and that's why I thought my contribution is, what does business need? And I do agree with what the gentleman said in most of what he said. I've got 5 things that business needs, and a lot of it has been said, so I'm reinforcing. But skills, very important. The point about the literacy rate, the quality of education, not just spending on education, the quality of education. Deregulation, not just the visible regulations, but the invisible regulations. The idea that if you're an inbound foreign investor, you probably have to have a partnership with a state-owned enterprise in order to win major infrastructure projects. That really leads to reduced quality of infrastructure investment, which is the next thing that business needs, is infrastructure. And again, quality of infrastructure spend, which I think the President has done an amazing thing in switching spending from subsidies to infrastructure. The next thing that has to be done in infrastructure is improving the quality of the investment in infrastructure. And then the 2 other things that haven't been mentioned much today, but they're very important. One is the rule of law, a robust judicial system, so that if you have a contract You know that if there's a breach of the contract, you can go to the court and get a reliable opinion based on the facts. And finally, corruption. I do a lot talking to foreign investors when they're deciding. There are something like 190 countries in the world where people can choose to invest. One of the reasons they choose not to invest in Indonesia is corruption. It's been, even in last month, 2 investors have said that to me, that that's the reason why they go somewhere else. So that's my summary, I think, of what business needs. And Filipe Jesus did mention that about talk to business. The other thing he said, I really liked his last point on investments, because actually I think government policy on encouraging investment is too much focused on incentives. If you look at the track record of special economic zones in Indonesia, actually it's not like Shenzhen. So maybe there's a limit to what we can learn from China, because if I can make a profit, I can probably make a profit even without the incentives, as long as these other things are in place.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much, Pa. Let me give the floors to 2 speakers to comment. Well, I hope the committee can show us a question coming from Slido.com, please.
Thank you so much. I don't think I have comments on the comments. That would be the comments are really what they are, and I accept them, etc. I honestly, I have a problem with my hearing with the echo here. So I do not know whether I heard or probably it was a mix of yes, I agree with you, and I disagree with you, probably. So thank you so much for the agreements. The disagreement at the beginning, I do not know whether it was with the concept or the idea of complexity. Look, I would not make a big issue out of this. If you make an issue out of this, you need to make an issue out of the notion of revealed comparative advantage, the idea of the middle income trap, etc. We find it a tremendously useful idea to talk about a structural transformation. The idea of complexity simply is an index that takes into account how diversified an economy is, and this is something that everybody understands, and how unique the products that economy exports are, meaning how many other countries in the world do produce. And there is a method to combine that and produce the index of complexity. When you go to the data, you need to put a pinch of salt, of course, interpreting this data like you do with any other series. But at the end of the day, I find it tremendously useful when I look at the big picture to talk, and there is a match, very good match, between the products that a country produces and exports and wages. I go back to the examples that I was discussing. When Professor Lawrence was talking about the airplane, well, all the countries contributing to the Boeing are countries with $40,000 per capita income. I ask you a question. Do you think that our waiters, not only in Indonesia, anywhere in the world, could ever make $100,000? US dollars. Can I take that as a no? Tell me why no. Is there any law that a waiter cannot earn? No, there isn't any law. It's the type of product, the type of service. Yeah. It's very simple. For a waiter to earn $100,000, you will have to pay $30 for a beer. And there is no way that you're going to pay $30,000 for a beer. But if I tell you, can a lawyer or a logistics expert or an engineer earn $100,000, immediately you would say, of course, yes. You are not surprised. So there is a very good match between the products and services that a country produces and exports and the wages. And there are a lot of things behind that, which is education, et cetera, et cetera. But I think as an overall idea, it has helped us very well to really understand why do countries move forward, why do countries end up having wages and income per capita much higher than other economies. I will stop here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jesus. We actually have a few questions here from the audience. I don't know whether the panel can see that, but one question, I think it's for David. I think the question is why China labor productivity falling since 2013? And yeah, the next question too, I guess. But maybe you start with it.
Sure. Labour productivity falling, well, earlier than that, since 2010. And I think the first point to make there would be that productivity gains are easier to make at earlier stages of industrialisation. And as China has industrialised rapidly and moved closer to the technological frontier, then gains in productivity continue to find harder to come by. Not to say the gains are not there; they still have positive productivity growth, but it is getting harder for them to do so as they're getting richer and easier. The lower lying fruits, as economists like to say, have already been picked. But I would say that natural process, of course that's in the context of globally productivity growth has been slow over the period, but that hasn't been helped by what China has been doing to sustain its rate of growth through this period. They're putting investment into all the wrong places in the name of supporting headline growth and delivering on their own centennial goals. So, I mean, China is famous for picking long-lived goals, and its centennial goal of 2021 is to double per capita income from 2010 levels. The centenary in 2021 being centenary of the establishment of the Communist Party. And that has led them into away, I think, from the benefits of their early reform period where investments were being driven because, to the point of the rapporteur, that the state was stepping out of the way and allowing investments to be made on the basis of profit. Now they're being made on the basis for other reasons.
Thank you. I guess one of the questions there is for you, Pak Jesus, but also I would like to touch on the final question on the industrial development around the center of Java Island, and how would you think that could also kind of like, you know, for the industrial development suggestion to kind of like go beyond that?
Let me start, I think, with the first two. Sorry, the second and the third. In the middle, that are much more related. The question of the 100 products and
the long jumps.
The long jumps.
Yeah.
Because they're basically the same thing.
Yes.
By long jumps, I mean going really far from the current structure today. What I describe as short jumps, these are products that it should be very easy for Indonesia to produce and export, but it doesn't do it. So if you look at the trade metrics of the world, you observe that countries that produce, let's say, shirts, also export trousers. So you imagine then you go to Indonesia and you realize that Indonesia produces shirts, but not trousers. And it's obvious the question, why not? So this would be a short jump. Very easy to think about. These products, these are the ones that we have identified, the 74 that I was talking about, which is, this should be a no-brainer. These are the hanging fruits for Indonesia. How do you do this? You talk to the companies that could produce these products. What is a long jump? The long jump is an airplane. The long jump is an MRI machine. Those are the products in the top 100 that Indonesia today does not have the capabilities. So somebody's asking me, name the Indonesian product that you think can go. I don't know, that's not for me to answer. But what I do propose is a high-level discussion with the government and the private sector. I would identify the most advanced, technologically advanced companies in Indonesia, and I would sit down with them. And maybe it's not the top 100, maybe it's the top 500. It doesn't matter. Still, it's a long jump for Indonesia. The question is, would it make sense? Would we have the capabilities? Can we develop them in the next 10 to 20 years? What sort of public inputs do you need? That's the type of discussion and dialogue that I would have with the private sector, and then the result of that dialogue will be the identification of these products. Or maybe the answer is, no, it is not worth doing it because it's too risky. That could be the answer too.
Okay, thank you, Pa. I guess also before I end this session, I think the next session will explore a bit more on the how question, especially the question that raises on the importance of the scale, the labor market, you know, so I hope we can learn further from that, but do you have any other additional before?
Just
on the second one?
The second question, I guess, I don't know Indonesia very well, but from what I've heard in the last day, has been concerns about an SOE sector, very strong SOE sector, a lack of competition, and restrictions around foreign investment, the point that one of the rapporteurs made, which actually are very similar to what we hear in China, notwithstanding the differences in the political framework.
No, thank you. So allow me to join me to thank the two speakers, Jesus Filipe and David Wills, for interesting discussion, and we'll hope to continue discussion exploring on the how question further. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and please remain on stage. Ladies and gentlemen, give a round of big applause once again to the speakers and also the moderator. Thank you very much. And to give the token of appreciation, we would like to invite Mr. Irfa Amri as the Directors of Regional and Bilateral Policy, Fiscal Policy Agency. Dipersilakan Bapak. So once again, we'd like to say thank you to the speakers, Mr. David Woods from Australian Treasury Overseas Representations in China, and also Mr. Jesus Philippe from ADB. And also thank you to our moderator, Mrs. Della Temanggung from Prospera. Thank you very much. Please kindly take a photo session together. Once again, thank you very much to our speakers and moderator. Thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we'll continue the next sessions of today, but before that, we'd like to please you to have a break for a while. We'll please you to have the coffee break that we have already prepared for you in the foyer area for 10 minutes. So once again, we are expecting you to come back again to continue the sessions, the session 3, after 10 minutes. Thank you. Sekali lagi kepada Bapak dan Ibu yang terhormat, kami persilakan untuk menikmati coffee break terlebih dahulu di foyer area dan diharapkan untuk kembali lagi ke ruangan ini setelah 10 menit. Terima kasih.